The sun beat down on Sarah's back like a blacksmith's hammer. Dust devils danced across the parched earth, mirroring the frantic whirl of thoughts in her head. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, and her throat felt like sandpaper. Each breath was a struggle, a reminder of how far she still had to go. They were gaining on her. She could feel it. She stumbled, her worn boots catching on a gnarled root. For a moment, she thought she'd fall, but she managed to regain her balance, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of shelter, any place to hide. But there was nothing, just endless stretches of dry land, dotted with cacti that seemed to mock her with their silent, prickly existence. She knew what they wanted. The map. The one she'd risked everything to steal. She'd overheard their plans, plans that would bring misery to innocent people, and she couldn't let that happen. So, she'd taken it. Now, they were hunting her like an animal. Fear was a constant companion. It gnawed at her insides, whispering doubts, and painting terrifying pictures in her mind. She imagined their faces, cruel and unforgiving, their eyes filled with a cold, hard light. She knew what they were capable of. She'd seen it. She pushed herself onward, her legs aching, her lungs burning. She had to keep moving. She had to stay ahead. Hope was a fragile thing, flickering like a candle in a storm, but she clung to it with all her might. She had to believe that she could escape, that she could find a safe place, that she could make a difference. But deep down, a chilling voice whispered that it was only a matter of time. They were too close. She was too tired, and the desert was a cruel and unforgiving mistress. Suddenly, the ground vibrated beneath her feet. At first, she thought it was another trick of the heat, another phantom menace conjured by her weary mind. But then she heard it, the unmistakable thunder of hooves. Her breath hitched in her throat. They found her. She scrambled for cover, spotting a cluster of jagged rocks a short distance away. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She darted toward it, her legs pumping, her heart hammering. She risked a glance over her shoulder. A lone rider, silhouetted against the setting sun, was bearing down on her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. He looked like death riding a horse. She reached the rocks and squeezed herself into a narrow crevice, pressing her body against the cool stone. She could hear the rider approaching, the rhythmic clatter of hooves growing louder and louder. She closed her eyes, her hands clenched into fists. This was it. The horse stopped just a few feet away. Sarah could hear the animal's heavy breathing, the creak of leather. She held her breath, waiting for the inevitable. The rider dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was close. So close. She opened her eyes a crack. He was even bigger than she'd imagined. His face was weathered and hard, etched with deep lines that spoke of a life lived under the harsh sun. A thick mustache obscured his upper lip, and his eyes, when she finally dared to meet them, were like chips of flint, cold and unyielding. He wore a gun belt low on his hips, the handle of his revolver glinting in the fading light. He looked every inch the ruthless killer she'd been running from. Well, he said, his voice a low growl. What have we here? Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. Fear had paralyzed her. She knew what he wanted. She knew what he was going to do. She braced herself for the pain, for the darkness. She expected him to kill her. But instead of reaching for his gun, the cowboy, whose name, she would soon learn, was Jed, did something completely unexpected. He reached into his saddlebag. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, anticipating the cold steel of a blade, the crushing blow of a fist. But it never came. Instead, she heard the clinking of metal and the sloshing of water. She cautiously opened one eye. Jed was holding out a canteen. You look parched, girl, he said, his voice still gruff, but with an edge of something else concerned. Take a drink. Sarah stared at the canteen, her mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to be begging for her life, not being offered water. I don't understand, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Jed sighed, a puff of air that stirred the dust at her feet. Understand what? You're thirsty. I'm offering you water. It ain't rocket science. He held the canteen out further, his expression unreadable. Sarah hesitated for another moment. Then, driven by a thirst that had become almost unbearable, she reached out and took it. The metal was cool against her skin. She lifted the canteen to her lips and drank deeply, the water cool and refreshing. It was the best thing she'd ever tasted. When she finally lowered the canteen, Jed was watching her, his flinty eyes narrowed. "Now," he said, "how about you tell me what you're doing out here all alone, and why you look like you've been running from the devil himself?" He then reached into the same saddlebag and pulled out a piece of jerky. "Here, eat something, your skin and bones." Sarah took the jerky, her hand trembling. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was a trap, that Jed was playing some kind of game. But she was too tired, too hungry, too thirsty to care. She tore off a piece of the jerky and chewed slowly, savoring the salty, smoky flavor. She still expected him to hurt her, but the water and food had given her a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this cowboy wasn't who she thought he was. Maybe, just maybe, she had a chance. But she knew, deep down, that she still had to be careful. Very careful. This whole situation felt wrong. Too good to be true. The jerky helped. It wasn't much, but it gave her the strength to speak, to try and explain. But how could she tell this stranger, this imposing figure of the West, about the stolen map, about the ruthless men who were hunting her? She didn't even know if she could trust him. A memory flashed through her mind. Silas, the leader of the gang, his face contorted with rage as he discovered the map was missing. She remembered the fear in the eyes of the townsfolk as they spoke of his cruelty, his willingness to do anything to get what he wanted. He'd been planning to divert the river, leaving their farms barren and their families starving, all to line his own pockets with gold he'd find further downstream. The map showed the secret location of a large gold deposit. She shuddered, pulling herself back to the present. Jed was still watching her, his expression patient but unwavering. She knew she couldn't keep the truth hidden forever. I stole something," she finally confessed, her voice barely audible. "Something that belongs to some very dangerous man." Jed raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "A map," she said, her voice growing stronger. "It shows the location of something they want, something that could hurt a lot of people." She hesitated, then added, They were gonna take the water." Jed's eyes hardened. "Take the water? From whom?" "From the people of Willow Creek," Sarah said. "They were gonna divert the river." A muscle twitched in Jed's jaw. "Silas and his gang?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. How did he know about Silas? Was he involved? "I had to stop them," she said pleadingly. "I couldn't let them do it. So I took the map." Tears welled up in her eyes. She was so tired, so scared. She just wanted it all to be over. Jed stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, he slowly shook his head. "Willow Creek," he muttered. "Those poor folks have been through enough already." Jed looked out at the darkening landscape, his expression grim. The wind picked up, whistling through the rocks, carrying the scent of rain. He turned back to Sarah, his eyes filled with a new resolve. "All right, girl," he said, his voice firm. "I'm going to help you." Sarah stared at him, stunned. "Help me? But why?" Jed shrugged. "Willow Creek is my home. I won't stand by and watch Silas and his bunch ruin it." He paused, then added, "Besides, you had the guts to do what others were too afraid to. That deserves something." "But they'll kill you," Sarah protested. "Silas, he's not afraid of anything." "Maybe," Jed said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "But he ain't met me yet." He stood up, his tall frame silhouetted against the last rays of the setting sun. "We need to get moving. They won't be far behind." He extended a hand to Sarah, helping her to her feet. "Can you ride?" he asked. Sarah nodded, though she hadn't been on a horse in years. "Good," Jed said. "We'll ride through the night. Try to put some distance between us and them." He led her to his horse, a magnificent black stallion. He helped her mount, then swung himself up into the saddle behind her. "Hold on tight," he said, his voice close to her ear. "It's going to be a bumpy ride." With a gentle nudge, he spurred the horse forward. They galloped off into the darkness, the only sound the pounding of hooves and the whisper of the wind. Sarah clung to Jed, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. She still didn't fully trust him, but she knew that he was her only chance. She was placing her life entirely in the hands of this enigmatic cowboy. As they rode, the first drops of rain began to fall, washing away the dust and grime of the day. Sarah looked up at the sky, a sliver of a smile gracing her lips. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally starting to look up. Maybe, just maybe, she would survive this after all. The rain intensified, turning the parched earth into a muddy mire. The darkness was thick, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning. Sarah shivered, partly from the cold, partly from fear. She pressed closer to Jed, seeking warmth and a sense of security. "How do you know Silas?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper above the storm. Jed hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "He used to ride with my brother," he said. "Before," he trailed off, his voice filled with a pain that Sarah couldn't quite understand. "Before what?" she pressed. "Before Silas changed," Jed said, his voice hardening. "Before he became the greedy, ruthless man he is today." He didn't elaborate, and Sarah didn't push him. She sensed that it was a painful subject, one he wasn't ready to discuss. They rode in silence for a long time, the only sound the pounding rain and the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves. Sarah tried to stay awake, but the exhaustion was overwhelming. She found herself drifting in and out of consciousness, her head lolling against Jed's back. Suddenly, Jed pulled the horse to a halt. "We need to find shelter," he said, his voice urgent. "This storm is getting worse." He scanned the landscape, his eyes searching for any sign of refuge. Finally, he spotted a small cave hidden behind a rocky outcrop. "There," he said, pointing. "Let's see if it's dry." He dismounted and helped Sarah down from the horse. They led the stallion into the cave, finding a relatively dry spot near the back. Jed quickly gathered some dry branches and started a small fire. The flames flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. As the fire crackled and popped, Sarah began to feel a little warmer, a little safer. She watched Jed as he tended to the flames, his face etched with concentration. She still didn't fully understand him, but she knew that he was a good man, a man of his word. And that, for now, was enough. The map was safely tucked away inside her shirt. "We'll rest here for a few hours," Jed said, turning to her. "Then we'll move on. They won't stop looking for you." He stared intently at Sarah, or the map. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a landscape washed clean and smelling fresh. The sun rose, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Jed woke Sarah before dawn, his movements quiet and efficient. They ate a quick breakfast of dried fruit and jerky, then saddled the horse and set off again. They rode for hours, the terrain gradually changing from rocky desert to rolling hills covered in sparse vegetation. Jed was a skilled tracker, constantly scanning the ground for signs of pursuit. He taught Sarah how to read the land, how to spot broken twigs and disturbed earth that could indicate someone had passed by recently. "They're still out there," he said grimly, pointing to a set of faint tracks in the distance. "But they're losing ground." As they traveled, Sarah began to learn more about Jed. He was a man of few words, but he had a quiet strength and a deep sense of justice. He told her stories about Willow Creek, about the hardworking families who lived there, about the beauty of the land. He spoke of his brother, but only briefly, and Sarah sensed that the pain was still too raw. She, in turn, told him about her life before she'd stolen the map. She had been a teacher in a small town, dedicated to helping her students learn and grow. But when she'd overheard Silas's plans, she knew she couldn't stand by and do nothing. She had to act, even if it meant risking her own life. As they shared their stories, a bond began to form between them. Sarah began to trust Jed completely, relying on his strength and his knowledge. She knew that he would do everything in his power to protect her and to save Willow Creek. In the afternoon, they came across a dried-up riverbed. Jed dismounted and examined the ground carefully. "This is where they'll expect us to cross," he said. "We need to find another way." He led the horse along the riverbed for several miles, searching for a safer passage. Finally, He found a narrow canyon that offered a hidden route across. It was a risky move, but it would throw their pursuers off their trail. As they entered the canyon, Sarah felt a sense of foreboding. The walls were high and narrow, blocking out the sunlight. It felt like they were entering the jaws of a beast. She glanced at Jed, his face grim, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver. She knew that they were walking into danger. She just didn't know how much. They hadn't gone far into the canyon when the ambush came. A hail of gunfire erupted from the rocks above, echoing through the narrow passage. Jed reacted instantly, yanking Sarah from the horse and shoving her against the canyon wall. "Stay down," he shouted above the din of the gunfire. He drew his revolver and returned fire, his shots precise and deadly. But he wasn't aiming to kill. Sarah noticed that he was carefully targeting the rocks around the gunmen, forcing them to take cover. He's not trying to kill them, she realized, her voice trembling. Jed glanced at her, his eyes grim. "I don't want blood on my hands if I can help it," he said, "but I will protect you." The gunfight raged on, the canyon filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Jed moved with incredible speed and agility, dodging bullets and returning fire with unwavering accuracy. He seemed to know exactly where the gunmen were, anticipating their every move. One of the gunmen, a burly man with a scarred face, charged down the rocks, brandishing a knife. Jed sidestepped the attack and disarmed the man with a swift kick to the wrist. The knife clattered to the ground. Jed then delivered a sharp blow to the man's jaw, knocking him unconscious. Another gunman tried to flank them, but Jed spotted him in time. He fired a shot that grazed the man's arm, forcing him to drop his weapon and retreat. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the gunfire subsided. The remaining gunmen, realizing they were outmatched, retreated into the rocks. Jed cautiously approached the edge of the canyon, scanning the area. "They're gone," he said, his voice tight. "For now." He turned back to Sarah, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. Sarah nodded, her body trembling. I think so," she stammered. "But you could have killed them. Why didn't you?" Jed sighed, holstering his revolver. "Killing them wouldn't solve anything," he said. "It would just create more problems. Besides," he added, a hint of a smile playing on his lips, "I prefer to do things the right way." He helped Sarah back onto the horse, his touch gentle and reassuring. They rode out of the canyon, leaving the unconscious gunman behind. Sarah looked back, her mind still reeling from the ambush. She had seen a different side of Jed, a side that was both fierce and compassionate. She knew then that he was more than just a cowboy. He was a protector. They made camp that night in a small clearing, hidden among the trees. Jed built a fire, and the flames danced merrily, casting a warm glow on their faces. The air was still and quiet, a welcome change after the chaos of the canyon. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "You said Silas used to ride with your brother," she said, her voice soft. "What happened?" Jed hesitated, his gaze fixed on the flames. He took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to speak. "My brother, Caleb, was a good man," he said, his voice low. "He was kind and generous, always willing to help others. Silas, he was different back then. He was lost, searching for something. Caleb took him under his wing, showed him the right way." He paused, his voice filled with sadness. "But Silas, he was always greedy. He wanted more than he deserved. He started making bad choices, getting involved in shady deals. Caleb tried to stop him, but it was no use." Jed looked up at Sarah, his eyes filled with pain. "One day they got into a fight, a bad one. It was over a gold claim. Silas, he shot Caleb, killed him." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, Jed," she said, her voice filled with sympathy. "I'm so sorry." Jed nodded, his jaw tight. "I swore I'd make him pay for what he did," he said. "But I never got the chance. He disappeared, went off the grid. Until now." Sarah reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle and comforting. "You will," she said. "You'll stop him. I know you will." Jed squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Sarah," he said. "That means a lot." He released her hand and looked back at the fire. "What about you?" he asked. "You said you were a teacher. How did you end up stealing a map from a gang of outlaws?" Sarah sighed, her own memories flooding back. She told him about her students, about her passion for teaching, about her determination to make a difference in the world. She told him about overhearing Silas's plans, about the fear in the eyes of the townsfolk, about her decision to risk everything to save Willow Creek. As she spoke, Jed listened intently, his eyes filled with admiration. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "You're a brave woman, Sarah," he said. "You did the right thing." They sat in silence for a while longer, the fire crackling and popping. The bond between them had deepened, forged in the crucible of shared experiences and painful memories. They were no longer just strangers traveling together. They were friends, allies, bound by common purpose. And as the night wore on, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if they might become something more. The air between them crackled with an unspoken tension, a hint of something deeper, something more profound. The next morning, they rode towards the town of Redemption. Jed explained that he had some old friends there who could help them get supplies and perhaps provide some information about Silas's whereabouts. "Redemption ain't much," Jed said as they crested a hill overlooking the town. "But it's got good people. Most of them, anyway." From their vantage point, Sarah could see a cluster of buildings huddled together, surrounded by a vast expanse of open land. A dusty main street ran through the center of town, lined with a saloon, a general store, and a blacksmith shop. A few horses were tethered outside the saloon, and a lone figure sat on the porch of the general store, whittling a piece of wood. As they rode into town, Sarah felt a sense of unease. The town seemed deserted, almost too quiet. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Jed led her to the saloon, dismounted, and tied the horse to a hitching post. "Wait here," he said. "I'll see if I can find someone I know." He strode into the saloon, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver. Sarah watched him go, her heart pounding. She felt vulnerable and exposed, sitting alone on the horse in the middle of the deserted street. A few minutes later, Jed emerged from the saloon, a tall, wiry man with a handlebar mustache by his side. The man's name was Hank, and Jed explained that he was the town's sheriff. "Hank's a good man," Jed said. "He'll help us." Hank nodded, his eyes scanning the street. "What brings you to Redemption, Jed?" he asked. "And who's your friend?" Jed explained the situation, telling Hank about the stolen map, about Silas's plans to divert the river, and about their escape from the canyon. Hank listened intently, his expression growing grim. "Silas is here?" he asked, his voice low. Jed nodded. "We think so. We saw signs that they were headed this way." Hank sighed. "This is bad," he said. "Real bad. Silas and his gang are trouble. They've been terrorizing the countryside for months." He paused, then added, "I'll do what I can to help you, Jed, but I can't promise anything. This town is too small to take on Silas and his gang." "We're not asking you to fight them, Hank," Jed said. "We just need some supplies and some information, and maybe a place to hide for a while." Hank nodded. "I can do that," he said. "Come on, let's get you both inside." He led them into the saloon, where a few other patrons were gathered around a table, playing cards. The atmosphere was tense, and Sarah could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her. She knew that they were strangers in a hostile land, and that their safety depended on Jed's connections and Hank's willingness to help. As Hank led them to a table in the back of the saloon, the swinging doors burst open, and Silas strode in, followed by four of his men. The room went silent. All eyes turned to the newcomers. Silas's gaze swept across the room, settling on Jed and Sarah. A cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look what the cat dragged in." Jed stood up, his hand moving towards his revolver. "Silas," he said, his voice cold. "Jedediah," Silas replied, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Fancy meeting you here. I was wondering where you've been hiding." He gestured to Sarah. "And who's this pretty little thing?" he asked. "She looks familiar." "Leave her out of this, Silas," Jed warned. "Oh, I don't think so," Silas said. "She's got something that belongs to me. A little map, perhaps." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew that this was it, the moment of truth. Hank stepped forward, his hand resting on his own gun. "This is my town, Silas," he said. "I won't allow any trouble here." Silas laughed. "You and what army, Sheriff?" he sneered. He nodded to his men, and they spread out, positioning themselves around the room. The patrons of the saloon tensed, their hands hovering near their own weapons. A standoff was inevitable. Jed looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with concern. "Stay behind me," he whispered. Silas took a step closer, his eyes fixed on Jed. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Jedediah," he said. "I just want what's mine. Give me the map, and I'll let you both walk away." "It doesn't work that way, Silas," Jed replied. "You're not going to hurt anyone else." "That's where you're wrong, Jedediah," Silas said, his voice hardening. "I'm going to do whatever it takes to get what I want. And if that means spilling a little blood, so be it." He drew his revolver, the click echoing through the silent room. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable violence. She expected the first shot to ring out any second. Redemption had become anything but. Just as Silas was about to pull the trigger, Jed spoke, his voice calm and steady. "All right, Silas," he said. "You win. I'll give you the map." Silas smirked. "That's what I thought," he said. "Hand it over." "But not here," Jed said, his eyes darting around the room. "Too many innocent people. Let's take this outside." Silas hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "What are you up to, Jedediah?" he asked. "Nothing," Jed replied. "I just don't want anyone to get hurt. Let's go to the edge of town. We can settle this there." Silas considered this for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he said, "but don't try anything funny. I'll be watching you." Jed slowly backed away, keeping his eyes on Silas. He gestured to Sarah, and she followed him, her heart pounding with fear. Hank watched them go, his face etched with concern. As they walked out of the saloon, Jed whispered to Sarah, "Stay close to me, and be ready to run." They walked down the dusty street, Silas and his men following close behind. The townspeople watched them from their windows and doorways, their faces filled with dread. When they reached the edge of town, Jed stopped. "All right, Silas," he said. "Here's the map." He reached into his shirt and pulled out a piece of paper. But instead of handing it to Silas, he tossed it into the air. "Catch," he shouted. As Silas and his men reached for the paper, Jed grabbed Sarah's hand and ran. They sprinted towards the blacksmith shop, Jed shouting, "Hank, now!" Suddenly, the town came alive. People poured out of the buildings, armed with rifles and shotguns. They opened fire on Silas and his men, creating a wall of lead that forced them to take cover. Jed and Sarah reached the blacksmith shop and ducked inside. Hank was waiting for them, a grim expression on his face. "What's the plan, Jed?" he asked. "We're going to use this town to our advantage, Hank," Jed said, a glint in his eye. "We're going to outsmart them." He quickly explained his plan to Hank and Sarah, his voice low and urgent. Sarah listened intently, her fear gradually giving way to hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could actually pull this off. Jed's plan was risky, but it was their only chance. They had to trust that the people of Redemption would stand with them. They had to trust that Jed could outsmart Silas. And they had to trust that, in the end, good would triumph over evil. The showdown began. Jed, Sarah, and Hank slipped out the back of the blacksmith shop and made their way through a series of back alleys, using the buildings as cover. The townspeople, armed with whatever they could find, kept up a steady barrage of gunfire, keeping Silas and his men pinned down. Jed's plan was to divide and conquer. He knew that he couldn't take on the entire gang at once. He had to isolate them one by one. He led Sarah and Hank to the general store, where they found a stash of ropes and sacks of flour. Jed quickly devised a plan to create a series of traps, using the flour to blind the gunmen and the ropes to trip them up. They set the traps throughout the store, then took up positions behind the counter, waiting for the inevitable. It wasn't long before two of Silas's men burst through the front door, their eyes blazing with anger. Jed and Hank opened fire, peppering the room with bullets. The gunmen ducked for cover, their aim thrown off by the flour dust that filled the air. One of them tripped over a rope and fell to the ground, sprawling amidst the sacks of flour. Jed quickly disarmed him and tied him up, leaving him for Hank to watch. The other gunman managed to escape, but Jed knew that he wouldn't be gone for long. He turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with determination. "We need to get to Silas," he said. "He's the one calling the shots. If we can take him down, the rest will fall apart." They slipped out of the general store and made their way towards the saloon, where they knew Silas would be hiding. As they approached, they could hear the sounds of gunfire and shouting. The townspeople were putting up a valiant fight, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Jed knew that he had to act fast. He burst through the doors of the saloon, his revolver blazing. He moved with incredible speed and agility, dodging bullets and disarming gunmen. He wasn't trying to kill them. He was simply trying to subdue them, to take them out of the fight. He used his fists, his feet, and even the environment to his advantage, sending gunmen crashing into tables, chairs, and even the bar itself. He was a whirlwind of motion, a force of nature. Finally, he came face to face with Silas. The two men stared at each other, their eyes locked in a deadly gaze. "It's over, Silas," Jed said, his voice cold. "You're not going to hurt anyone else." Silas snarled and raised his revolver. But before he could fire, Jed moved with lightning speed. He disarmed Silas with a swift kick to the wrist, then delivered a knockout blow to his jaw. Silas crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The remaining gunmen, seeing their leader defeated, surrendered. The showdown was over. Redemption had been saved. With Silas and his gang subdued, Sheriff Hank and the townspeople quickly rounded them up and locked them in the town jail. The stolen map, which had been recovered from Silas's pocket, was now safely in Hank's possession. The town of Redemption erupted in celebration. The people cheered and clapped, their faces filled with relief and gratitude. They had faced a formidable threat, and they had emerged victorious. Sarah watched the celebrations with a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had come to Redemption expecting the worst, but she had found something unexpected, a community of brave and resilient people who were willing to stand up for what was right. Jed stood beside her, his arm brushing against hers. "They did good," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. Sarah smiled. "They did," she agreed. "But you were the one who showed them the way." Jed shrugged, his cheeks flushing slightly. "I just did what needed to be done," he said. Hank approached them, a wide smile on his face. "Well, Jed," he said, "looks like you saved the day. Again." He clapped Jed on the shoulder. "I don't know what we would have done without you," he added. "You would have figured it out," Jed said. "You always do." Hank shook his head. "Maybe," he said, "but it sure was easier with you around." He turned to Sarah. "And thank you, ma'am," he said, "for having the courage to steal that map. You saved a lot of lives." Sarah nodded, her heart filled with gratitude. "I just did what I thought was right," she said. Hank smiled. "Well, you did good," he said. "Real good." He paused, then added, "So what are you going to do now? Are you going to stay in Redemption?" Sarah hesitated. She had grown to care for the people of Redemption, but she knew that her journey wasn't over yet. She still had to deliver the map to the authorities to ensure that Silas and his gang were brought to justice. She looked at Jed, her eyes filled with uncertainty. She knew that whatever she decided, she wanted him to be a part of it. "I don't know," she said, her voice soft. "I haven't decided yet." Jed looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. He knew that she had to follow her own path, even if it meant leaving him behind. "Whatever you decide," he said, "I'll be here." He took her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. Sarah squeezed his hand, her heart. The next morning, Sarah made her decision. She had to leave Redemption. She had to deliver the map to the authorities and ensure that Silas and his gang were brought to justice. It was her responsibility. She found Jed sitting on the porch of the general store, watching the sunrise. She sat down beside him, her heart heavy with sadness. "I'm leaving today," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jed nodded, his expression somber. "I know," he said. "I figured you would." "I wish I could stay," Sarah said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I've never felt so safe, so accepted, and I've never met anyone like you." Jed took her hand, his touch warm and comforting. "I feel the same way, Sarah," he said. "But I understand. You have to do what you have to do. Will I ever see you again? She asked, her voice trembling. Jed smiled, a hint of hope in his eyes. Maybe, he said. The world is a funny place. You never know what might happen. He stood up and pulled her to her feet. I should probably get going, she said. Jed nodded. I'll walk you to the edge of town, he said. They walked in silence, their hands clasped tightly together. When they reached the edge of town, they stopped. Well, Sarah said, her voice choked with emotion. This is it. Jed nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver compass. Here, he said, handing it to her. Take this. It'll help you find your way. Sarah took the compass, her fingers brushing against his. It was a beautiful object, intricately carved and polished to a shine. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling. Just remember, Jed said, his eyes filled with sincerity. No matter where you go, no matter what you do, you're not alone. You have friends and redemption. And you have me. He leaned down and kissed her gently on the forehead. Sarah closed her eyes, savoring the moment. She knew that she would never forget this man, this town, this experience. She opened her eyes and looked at Jed, her heart filled with love and gratitude. Goodbye, Jed, she said. Goodbye, Sarah, he replied. And be careful out there. Sarah turned and walked away, her back straight, her head held high. She knew that it was the right decision, even though it was the hardest thing she had ever done. She reached the top of the hill and turned back to look at redemption one last time. Jed was still standing there, watching her. She raised her hand in farewell, and he returned the gesture. Then, she turned and continued on her journey. Her journey was long and arduous, filled with dangers and challenges. But Sarah never gave up. She carried the silver compass with her always, a constant reminder of Jed and the people of redemption. It helped her navigate the vast and unforgiving landscape. But more importantly, it reminded her of her strength, her courage, and her unwavering commitment to justice. Finally, after weeks of travel, she reached the authorities and delivered the map. Silas and his gang were brought to justice, their reign of terror finally over. The people of Willow Creek were safe, their water secure. Sarah had done it. She had made a difference. She thought often of Jed, wondering if he was safe, wondering if she would ever see him again. She knew that he was a good man, a man of his word. And she knew that if fate allowed it, their paths would cross again someday. One day, as she was walking down a dusty street in a small town, she saw a familiar figure in the distance. Her heart leaped with joy. It was Jed. He saw her too, and a wide smile spread across his face. He ran towards her, his arms outstretched. They met in the middle of the street and embraced, their hearts filled with love and happiness. I knew I'd find you again, Jed said, his voice soft. I knew it too, Sarah replied, tears streaming down her face. They held each other close, their bond stronger than ever. They had faced adversity, they had overcome challenges, and they had found love in the most unexpected of places. Sarah had arrived in the West expecting to die. She expected a violent end, a merciless fate. But she had found something else entirely. She had found kindness, compassion, and love. She had found a protector in the most unlikely of places. She had found a cowboy who did the exact opposite of what she expected. And as they walked off into the sunset together, Sarah knew that her life had been forever changed by the experience. She had learned that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope, and that sometimes the greatest acts of kindness come from the most unexpected sources. The silver compass glinted in her pocket, a constant reminder of the cowboy who showed her that even in the Wild West, there was still room for a little bit of good.